No. The hair works. The hair works much better on you than it does on me.
Today, my guest is Professor Robert Dingwall, who sits on various COVID-related government advisory bodies and has been described as one of our most humane and compassionate commentators on the pandemic. As a professor of sociology and honorary member of the Faculty of Public Health, Professor Dingwall has a broad view of the impact of the disease, together with the collateral costs of the UK response to it. He believes coronavirus should not just be seen as a viral challenge, but also a societal one. If you're interested in these podcasts, please like and subscribe. We have plenty more guests coming up. Last January, I rang you up and we had a discussion about a novel virus that was worrying people a bit, had been causing deaths in Wuhan. And I rang you up to ask you about that. I don't think either of us would have ever predicted that we'd be having this conversation here now. I mean, you've played a key part in sort of decision making and the response and helping the media understand the virus. And as a leading sociologist and someone who understands a lot of different disciplines as well, what do you think, looking back, what do you think has gone wrong and what else, how can we avoid the same mistakes again?
Well, Lucy, I rather found myself in this role by accident because I'd been appointed to a committee called NERVTAG, which was set up in 2016, 2017 as a horizon scanning committee. And most of our early work was sort of receiving reports of exotic strains of flu in Chinese ducks and trying to work out whether they represented a hazard to humanity, I suppose. And that meant that we received this report of this mysterious new virus in Wuhan just before Christmas 2019, and sort of fell into a role that I'm not sure anybody would ever have appointed a sociologist to, thinking about, well, what are we going to do about this this new virus, which appears to be quite contagious and appears to be killing a lot of people. I think over the last 12 months or so, what we've come to see is that really the scientific advisory apparatus that was created for dealing with emergencies, for short-term emergencies, floods, weather events, major accidents, terrorist events, possibly sort of short-term infectious disease emergencies, hasn't really been fit for the long haul.
Just going back, what were the discussions at the time? Were there discussions around, you weren't involved with the early discussions about how we were going to plan our response to this, or whether we locked down or not? Was that part of, what you discussed in NERVTAG, or was it nothing to do with it?
No, that was really all very much above my pay grade. I mean, NERVTAG sort of fell into the orbit of SAGE, really, without much thought, really. So NERVTAG was asked to take a view on the nature of the threat that the Wuhan virus presented, which was its proper job, and then acquired all of these other functions as a standing group on the sort of lab science of the virus, and to some extent the public health and epidemiology of the virus, without having the sort of specialist mandate that either SPI-B, which was the behavioral scientists, or SPI-M, which was the modelers, or environmental modeling, which is largely the engineers. NERVTAG was sort of doing all the bits that weren't covered anywhere else.
What do you? Sorry, I interrupted you, but you said that the emergency apparatus that we launched then is not really something that's sort of fit for the purpose now. Is that what you meant? Can you expand?
Well, this is something that Gus O'Donnell has been saying, the former head of the civil service who devised the system in the first place, that the problem in some sense is that SAGE is fixated on the management of COVID-19. That's what it's asked to do, and that's what it does very effectively. What it's not asked to do is to collate the evidence on the broader societal impact. Every pandemic is a societal pandemic as much as a biomedical pandemic. And the bit that we've not been nearly as good at is thinking about the societal impacts and the proportionality of the response to COVID-19.
But we were dealing with an emergency that we had to address, that people were going to die. The broader things presumably have come out. We've heard about cancers and health, and the government would say it's actually addressing that, and everyone must come forward to the doctor for any suspicious symptoms. People, they've set money aside for mental health problems. They're sort of doing their best, they might argue, and people are working on those collateral damage as well. What else could you do?
Suppose you imagine the situation where in 2012, 2013, we'd had a couple of cases of Ebola appear in the East End of London. And that would have been a challenge for COBRA, which is a committee of ministers, civil servants, and leading people from the various agencies involved. And you might have set up a group of scientists with specialist knowledge of Ebola to advise them on containing that outbreak, sort of there, then, and for a short period. Where that system has broken down is in moving on from the emergency response, we must do something right here, right now, to the long-term management and the analysis and understanding of which of our interventions actually work, what collateral damage is happening, what's the proportionality of being so focused on the challenge of COVID-19 that we exclude almost everything else.
Take two parts of that. One, which interventions, and you're talking the non-drug interventions, what's the upshot of not looking into those interventions and which work and which don't? And what's the upshot of not looking, horizon scanning for the very collateral damage that you're referring to? What do you think?
What we've seen is that lockdowns are a very blunt instrument. I mean, there's quite a raging debate about whether they do any good at all.
What's your view on that?
Well, I think it's still very uncertain because the quality of the evidence is really very poor, because we've not tried to collect it in the way that we have done brilliant work on the drug trials and on the vaccine trials.
Would it ever be justified again with a similar threat? And I know you have to assess the threat first. Do you think lockdown should be, we may well have another pandemic. Should we just now avoid such a measure?
Well, if we had a better understanding of which parts of the lockdown actually made a difference, then we would be better informed for dealing with the future virus, which of course is not necessarily going to present exactly the same pattern of risk as COVID-19. I mean, we started out with a pandemic influenza plan, which was not a bad place to start because influenza is also a respiratory virus. And many of the things that were likely to work against flu were also likely to work against COVID. As time passed, we realized the differences between the two viruses. Influenza, for example, small children are super spreaders, and it matters quite a lot to try to control the transmission from small children. We know pretty confidently with COVID that small children are not super spreaders in that same way. In fact, they don't seem to spread as much as adults do. And therefore, the sorts of things that we might have done for an influenza pandemic are not appropriate for a COVID pandemic. And, we can and we should have stopped doing them. We really should not have been trying to clamp down on the lives of our smallest children in the way that we have.
Why did we do that?
Well, I think partly because we didn't focus enough on investing in the social science research on the NPIs, the non-pharmaceutical interventions. Partly because every societal pandemic has three components. It's a pandemic of fear, and that fear is usually proportionate at the very beginning, but it can linger on and be amplified in ways that are not helpful. You have a pandemic of explanation, which is everybody trying to explain what's happening from their own point of view and with the interests of their own institution or their own scientific discipline. And you've got a pandemic of action, which is the demand that something be done. And it doesn't really matter what that something is, but governments clearly feel great pressure to be seen to act.
But should governments be running a response to a pandemic, or should it be for society to decide how we want to live and what risk we want to live with once we've understood the risk better? And that comes back to our earlier points about understanding what, how we measure the responses. But, once we get to a place, who should make those decisions? Because are you sort of inferring that some of the decisions have been political rather than following the science, whatever that means?
Well, I mean, ultimately, all of the decisions are political. The scientists don't make decisions. They give the best advice that they can. And the politicians either decide or they make a kind of non-decision. I mean, if a scientist walks in and says, do this, then it's entirely proper for a politician to say, is that the only thing that we can do? The politicians should always interrogate scientists.